He flew to Dallas. I found a $212 receipt. Game over. Something was already wrong before I knew what wrong was, before I had a name for it or evidence to hold or any reason I could point to. Something in the way he kissed me goodbye that morning had felt like a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished reading yet, and then he was gone. Wheels up to Dallas. 3-day conference. Bad Wi-Fi. Baby, I love you. Delivered in that voice he uses when he's managing a situation rather than living in one, and I was sitting on the edge of our bed. Alone in the dark when the DM landed from an account with no photo, no name, just a string of numbers and 3 words that didn't ask a question so much as they detonated one: ask him why. And I sat there holding my phone in both hands the way you hold something you're not sure is safe to put down. Not breathing, not moving, just reading those 3 words over and over while something deep and wordless in my chest said it already knew, had always known, had been trying to tell me for months. In a language I kept refusing to learn, and I thought about the phone that was always face down now, the shower he always took before coming home instead of after, the way he laughed at texts he angled away from me. Small things. Things I had translated into something harmless every single time because I loved him with the kind of love that makes you complicit in your own blindness. The quiet, rearrange your whole life kind. The kind you don't talk about because it lives below the level of language. And now here I was in the dark with a stranger's 3 words and the ghost of his cologne still in the sheets beside me, and the very specific feeling of a woman standing at the exact moment her life divides into before and after. I went looking the way you go looking when you need evidence, not to confirm the truth, but to make the grief feel real enough to act on. I pulled up the shared credit card, the one he assumed I checked once a month on a good day, and there it was, 2 nights ago. A restaurant in Dallas with a name that sounded like a first date. $212, and that number landed in my stomach like a stone because $212 is not a man eating alone. That is a bottle of wine and candlelight and someone across the table. Receiving the version of him I thought was mine, and my hand started that small involuntary tremor that means your body is absorbing something your mind hasn't processed yet, and I called him at 11:47 p.m., and he picked up on the second ring. No hesitation, smooth and immediate the way a man answers when he's been doing this long enough to have a system, and he said, "Hey baby, what's wrong?" in that measured, careful tone, and I heard it, just for a half second before he adjusted, ambient warmth. Behind him, the acoustic texture of a room that was not a hotel, and then he stepped somewhere quieter and his voice dropped and he said, "It's late. Are you okay?" And I said, "Yes." I said I just missed him. And I held myself perfectly still on the inside while he said he loved me and he'd be home Thursday. And I said, "Okay, sleep good." And when the call ended, I sat with the silence and made a decision so quiet it barely registered as a decision at all. More like something clicking into alignment. A lock turning over, and I reached back out to that ghost account and typed 4 words. I know. Tell me everything, and what came back over the next 2 hours rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last year of my life. 14 months. That was the timestamp on the first photo. 14 months ago, and I need you to sit with that number because 14 months ago I was not whole. 14 months ago I had just lost a pregnancy. A baby we had named in conversation if not on paper, a future I had already started mentally furnishing, and when it happened I came apart in the way grief comes apart, completely and without warning, and he was there. He sat with me in that hospital room and held my hand and said the right things, and I built my entire recovery around the belief that we had gone through it together, that the loss had meant something to him too, that shared grief was a form of intimacy, that we were bonded now in a way that went deeper than ordinary love. And I had told myself that story every single day for 14 months while he was running a parallel life I knew nothing about. While my grief was still raw and my body was still healing, he had already started something with someone else. And he had held my hand through my devastation and then driven home to her, and I want you to understand what that specific realization does to a person, because it is not the same as ordinary heartbreak. It does not feel like loss. It feels like excavation. Like something reaching inside you and removing the foundation of a thing. And I sat there at 2 a.m. with 14 months of evidence on my screen, and I went completely still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of absolute clarity. The kind that arrives when everything soft in you has finally burned away, and what remains is just the clean, cold architecture of what needs to happen next. I called Deja at 6 a.m., my cousin, an accountant, the kind of person who responds to a crisis not with emotion, but with a legal pad, and when I finished talking, she didn't perform sympathy. She just said, "Send me everything," and then asked how much of his money was in accounts I had access to, and that question told me she understood the assignment. And here is what he never knew about the life we built together. I built it. Every account, every tax return, every automatic transfer, every safety net we both stood on was something I set up and maintained while he signed where I pointed and watched the numbers grow and believed that made him the provider. He had no idea that it made me the architect. He had no idea that access and authority are not the same thing and that I had quietly, without malice or premeditation, accumulated 4 years of both. And by Wednesday night, I had spoken to a lawyer named Patricia who reviewed my documentation without drama and said, "You were thorough," in a tone that felt like being handed something solid to stand on, and I had moved everything I was legally entitled to move, and I had printed the contents of that folder, and I set it on the kitchen counter. And then I did something that might seem strange, but was in fact the most intentional thing I did throughout this entire process. I cooked dinner, his favorite, set the table, lit the candles, put on the dress he always said made him feel like the luckiest man alive. And I sat down and I waited, not out of cruelty, but because I understood that the manner of an ending matters, and I had spent 4 years being the woman who made everything beautiful for him, and I decided that this last time would be no different. He walked in Thursday at 6:42 p.m. with his suitcase, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table and smiled, that wide, unguarded smile I had spent years collecting, and he said, "Baby, you didn't have to do all this," and I said, "I know." And I poured his wine, and I sat across from him, and I let him talk. I let him build the Dallas story detail by detail across the candlelight, smooth and practiced and completely fictional, and I listened without expression, without interruption, and I watched him feel safe. I watched him relax into the familiar shape of our life together. And when he finally exhaled and reached his hand across the table toward mine, I slid the manila folder across to him instead, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I watched his face, and what I saw was not guilt first. It was confusion, and then recognition. And then something structural giving way beneath his expression, that suspended terrible moment before collapse, and he opened it slowly and went completely still. Not performance, not theater, genuinely physically still the way a body goes still when the ground underneath it disappears. And he looked up at me and opened his mouth, and I held up one finger, just one, and I said, "Don't." And the word came out so even, so absent of heat, that it landed heavier than anything I could have screamed. And he closed his mouth, and the silence between us became the most honest thing that had ever existed in that room. And I stood up and told him the lawyer would be in touch, that his mother was coming this weekend for his things, that his name had been removed from every account he hadn't personally opened, and that everything in that folder had already been forwarded to every person in our shared life from his own email address, the one he'd given me in year 1 and never thought to change. And he sat there at the table I had set, and the food I had cooked, and the candles still burning, surrounded by the evidence of everything he had chosen, and he never spoke, not one word, and I walked to the bedroom and closed the door quietly behind me and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the silence on the other side of it, and I felt something return to me that I hadn't realized was gone. Not happiness, not yet, something older and quieter than happiness, something that felt like standing on solid ground after a very long time of not knowing where the floor was, and I understood in that moment that I had not just ended a relationship. I had found my way back to a woman I had been slowly, lovingly, completely abandoning, and she had waited, and she was done waiting, and she was already deciding what came next.